I'm talking about Moonshine. It's a way to deploy your Rails apps, manage your server configurations, and all kinds of cool stuff like that. So let's get started here. All right. First, a little bit about me. I'm the founder of Robot Mode LLC. We do Rails, iPhone, and I guess Palm Pre application development now. I did 5 years in the Navy, information systems technician, and then I worked for a popular adult website doing Ruby on Rails and Adobe Air stuff. So it was pretty cool. All right. Okay, first thing, deployment sucks. I mean, when you provision a new server, you have to install Ubuntu, update the packages, configure SSH, configure IP tables, build and install Apache or database, Ruby, Ruby gems, Passenger, ImageMagick, Postfix, cron, log rotate, NTP, Rails gems, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It takes forever and it's a pain. And then finally you can deploy. So what does Moonshine do? Well, Moonshine will update your packages, configure SSH, configure IP tables, build and install Apache or database, Ruby, Ruby gems, Passenger, ImageMagick, Postfix, cron, log rotate, NTP, Rails, gems, et cetera. It'll deploy your app using Capistrano, and it'll manage your server configs. You get to keep your server configuration in your version control, which is great. Okay, what's Moonshine built on? It's made by, first of all, it's made by a Rails machine. It's built ultimately on Puppet, which is covered up by Shadow Puppet, which is extracted from Moonshine. And Shadow Puppet provides a Ruby domain-specific language for Puppet. And then you've got Capistrano to deploy and push it out. There's a lot of plugins available for Moonshine. There's more being added. You've got AR Mailer for doing your background email. You've got a plugin that does local and Amazon S3 backups. You've got a plugin to manage God for your process monitoring. You've got plugins to manage IP tables, Memcache, Sphinx, SSH, and there's even one for WordPress. Now that WordPress is completely managed within the admin area, you don't have to upload your plugins or your themes anymore. So you can just push it out with WordPress and have Moonshine manage it for you. Okay, how do we get started? Well, first of all, you need a server running Ubuntu 8.10. I think that's Intrepid Ibex or something like that. You need a user on the server who has root privileges and can access your Git repository. And the BIOS is optional, but I thought 3 bullets looked better than 2. So, okay. All right. First thing, you want to install the plugins. You've got your existing Rails app. You want to deploy it. First, you'll install the Moonshine plugin. Then you'll install the SSH plugin and the IP tables plugin, and whatever other plugins you want. You don't have to do them right away unless you need them for your first deployment. You can always add them later. You run script generate Moonshine, which generates your moonshine.yml file, and it puts a manifest in app manifests. You can use your manifest to manage multiple servers if you want to configure your database server with one manifest, your Memcache server with another manifest, and your app servers with another manifest. Okay, next. You're going to make sure all your gems are declared in environment.rb, which you're all doing that already, I assume. You run rake moonshine gems, which will generate a gems.yml file, which tells Moonshine what gems to install. The reason you have to do this step every time you add or remove or change gems is just because there's other stuff in the environment.rb, and Moonshine uses it hashes all your system configs. So if it had to check that every time you did that, it would be kind of complicated. Okay, we've got our moonshine.yml. First, you're going to tell it what version of Ruby you want to run. By default, it's Ruby Enterprise Edition. You're going to tell it the application name, in this case, Ultranet Web. Your Rails user, your time zone, what directory to deploy to, what the domain name is, any aliases. If you're using asset host, you can put that in there, and then what shared directories there are, and those will be symlinked to the shared folder. Standard Capistrano stuff, and then you tell it your Git repository, and then If you have any local config files, like your database.yml, you probably don't want to put that in your version control. So anything in that local config will be it'll be symlinked from your local computer. It'll be uploaded and symlinked when you deploy. This SSH one right there is for the SSH plugin. You can tell it what port and what users you want to allow. It'll configure that for you. You can tell it if there's any gems that have system dependencies, like paperclip depends on ImageMagick. But it's smart enough. It knows a lot about a lot of the most common dependencies. RMagick and ImageMagick and all those other ones. Okay, and then you can put any configs that are not the default. So if you're running on VPS or you have your dedicated server or whatever, you can tell Passenger how your max pool size. You can tell MySQL to use this much memory. You can say you want to change your auto increment if you want to do sharding later on, which it does by default. It gives you auto increment 10, so that you can have up to 10 sharded servers later on. Just planning ahead. Okay, and then you've got your application manifest. This is some of the default stuff, but you give it the default stack, which tells it to install Rails, Apache, Passenger. It'll take your database.yml, and it'll figure out, okay, what database engine am I using? What's the username? What port is it running on? What host and all that stuff. It'll install it for you from that. It'll install and configure postfix, cron, logrotate, NTP. And then you tell it any plugins and recipes that you want to add on to that. So we've got our SSH and our IP tables plugins and recipes, which will configure. It'll configure SSH. Tell it, set the port that you specified in the Moonshine.yml. And if you have any, you can give it custom IP tables rules, but by default it uses a really sensible set. Okay, and then. Let's see, you've got an application packages method in application manifest, and that's where you can put some really specific stuff. You can set up your cron jobs in there. You can tell it to only do stuff on certain environments, like if you're using Capistrano extensions with the multi-staging stuff, you can tell it to only run certain things on certain servers. Okay, now that that's all done. Capify your app. Your deploy.rb is just that one line right there, unless you have specific stuff that you want to do, but that's all you need. You add your changes to get. You run cap deploy setup, which will install Ruby Enterprise Edition, and then you do your cap deploy, which will take all the needed dependencies for your application and deploy it for the first time. Now, the first time it's going to take a while because it's going to have to install Apache and ImageMagick, which I'm sure some of you know takes forever to install, but it'll do all that stuff for you, and then you've got a working Rails app from a bare Ubuntu server with just SSH. Now, every time you cap deploy, it'll verify your system config on each deploy. It'll run your migrations. It'll install your gems and their system dependencies. It'll pull down submodules. And the best part is you get to keep your system configuration in version control. So you can if you needed to move hosts or something like that, you can just, get it set up right away. It takes like 15 minutes for your first, 10 or 15 minutes for your first deploy. Now, what if you have a more complex setup? You can have per server manifest for your app servers, database servers, memcache server, all that stuff. You would just in your deploy.rb, you can use the set Moonshine manifest and specify manifests for the various server roles. By default, Moonshine sets your database auto increment to 10, just kind of planning ahead in case you need to do sharding later. You still have to set up your own proxy and stuff like that, but at least it's kind of planning for that. And then you can check the Moonshine Google group for more info. Okay, resources. You've got the source code and the wiki are on GitHub. The docs are on GitHub. The mailing list is on Google Groups, and I'm going to put up the slides on my blog, jarinudom.com, in the next few days. All right. Anybody got any questions? I have a question. What's sharding? Sharding is when for example, you would have like one database server would have all the records that end in 1. This is one way to do it. There's several ways to do it, but they might all end in 1, and you might add another one. They all end in 2. They all end in 3, et cetera, et cetera. So it sets the auto increment to 10, and then you can set up like a database proxy that will say, okay, well, I'm looking for this ID with this that ends in this, so I'm going to direct it to this database server. So when you start increasing or working on your performance, yeah.
Do you have Nginx support?
Nginx support is not in there right now, but Rails Machine says if you want to add it, go ahead and fork it and create a recipe for it. Since it runs on Puppet, I'm sure there's stuff out there already to get it to work. You just got to put it together.
What version is it on, and how much use has it seen so far?
Well, it doesn't really have a version as far as I know. I mean, there's been a lot of blog activity on it, and it's constantly being updated. So it's really fresh, and it's all the early kinks and things like that are worked out. It's really good. Rails Machine's been using it for a while, giving it to their customers, and then they open sourced it. Anybody else? Patrick.
So what do you like least about it?
What's that?
What do you like least about it?
What do I like least about it? The documentation for some of the recipes is not that great. You kind of have to dig through the template files to figure out what's going on. It took a while to figure out like what the syntax was for the cron jobs, and there's not a ton of documentation. If you're familiar with Capistrano and you're somewhat familiar with Puppet or Shadow Puppet, or you kind of know what's going on with server administration, then you should be fine. It's not overly complicated, and the defaults are really good, for your average one server setup. So.
Last month we talked about Chef. How do you compare Moonshine with Chef?
I've actually never used Chef, so I can't really compare it.
Well, you were at the talk, right?
What's that?
You were at the talk last month.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, what I got out of it was Chef seemed a lot more powerful, but a lot more complicated, just in my eyes. I've been using Moonshine and I like it, so I haven't really explored Chef a whole lot. All right. Anybody? Going? Okay. Thank you.